The Chosen has a timeline problem. It's been bugging me for quite some time now, and I think it's time we addressed it. Now, because I've been covering The Chosen content for a while now, I know that a bunch of well-meaning fans bristle at the thought of anyone raising even the slightest criticism of their favorite show, and while I think that we all need to calm down a bit, I think I should begin by saying that I get it. You love the show, and you don't want anyone tearing it down. That being said, before y'all pick up your stones, allow me to make something clear. The goal of this video is not to simply criticize the show. While some criticisms will be raised, yes, that's not the goal. The goal of this video is the same as all my other Chosen videos, to celebrate high-quality Christian content and, if at all possible, make the experience even more enjoyable for you. 3 seasons in, the show continues to be one of the best representations of Christian entertainment done well, but one place where the show has consistently dropped the ball is in regard to its timeline, which, if I'm being entirely honest, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Maybe you're amongst the fortunate multitude who hasn't even noticed this glaring issue, and if you are, I envy you. But as someone who owes most of his YouTube subscribers to the success of the show, and who, as a result, has analyzed each episode frame by frame a dozen times over, I unfortunately can't claim the same good fortune. I've noticed the timeline issues ever since the first time I watched the show, and the more and more I've analyzed it, the more and more unbearable the problems became. Some might say problems like this don't matter, but as someone who is passionate about storytelling, I can't say I agree. Sure, it's not a theological, doctrinal, or religious issue, but it is a storytelling issue, and if it's a storytelling issue, then it's an art issue. And if we want The Chosen to continue to be the masterful work of art that it's been so far, it needs to be addressed. It's time to take our heads out of the sand and address the elephant in the room. That being said, don't let your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid, because my goal in this video isn't to ruin The Chosen for you. Rather, my goal is to fix The Chosen timeline. Yes, you heard that right. Over the past few months, I've rewatched the entire show, taking copious notes on every chronological detail, and after hours and hours of pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into yet another Excel spreadsheet on my laptop, I'm here to tell you that I've cracked the case. I had to change some things around and rework some of the details in order to make it all work, but after months of preparation, I'm finally here to present to you the definitive Chosen timeline. Maybe definitive is a bit of an overstatement, but you get my point. Pull up a chair, prop up your feet, and grab a pack of popcorn, because today we're going to fix The Chosen timeline. In order to get things started, we need to look at the data that the show gives us, and there is a lot of data. In fact, other than the TV show 24, if you remember that show from a while back, I don't think I've ever seen a show that has made more chronological references than The Chosen, which makes the timeline issues all the more frustrating to me because they're all the more glaring. Before I get on my soapbox again, let's narrow the data down to the most important details. Other than the flashbacks and flash forwards, the first 3 seasons of the show give us 5 key chronological milestones in regards to the main story timeline. The first is that the main narrative of the show begins in AD 26, information we learn from the very first episode of the first season. This means that the starting point of the entire show, including the beginning of Jesus' ministry, is in AD 26. Second up is the fact that Matthew met Jesus on the, I quote, 4th morning of the 3rd week of the month of Adar, which we learn in the flash forward scene at the beginning of season 2. This roughly corresponds to February 20th, AD 26, which means that, assuming Matthew is correct in his dating, we know a rough date for when Matthew meets Jesus towards the end of season 1. Third up is the Feast of Tabernacles, which Jesus and his disciples attend halfway through season 2. According to the Jewish calendar, this would take place sometime in mid-October, which places us near the end of AD 26. Fourth up is Rosh Hashanah, which Jesus celebrates in Nazareth in the 3rd episode of season 3. Since Rosh Hashanah is 2 weeks before Tabernacles, we can't be dealing with AD 26 anymore, so we have to move into late September of the following year, AD 27, nearly a year after the events of the previous season at the Feast of Tabernacles. Our 5th and final chronological milestone is the Feast of Purim, which all the characters celebrate in Capernaum near the end of season 3. Purim is a spring festival taking place towards the end of March, which means that by the end of season 3, we've reached late March or early April, AD 28. These 5 indicators are the bedrock of the Chosen timeline, and if you can't tell already, there's some major problems. When watching the show, it feels like a few months, maybe a year at most, have passed since the beginning of season 1, but if these dates are correct, over 2 whole years have passed. By inserting time jump at certain locations, I think I've managed to reconcile most of them in a believable way, But one date that absolutely does not make any sense whatsoever is milestone number 2, with Matthew meeting Jesus in February of AD 26. This means that the group's subsequent journey down to Samaria and then to Jerusalem took place over the course of some 8 months, which makes no sense contextually speaking. The only way to reconcile this is to assume that Matthew simply got his dates wrong. But since that sounds uncharacteristic for Matthew, whose entire personality is centered around the fact that he is a very precise character, my headcanon is that maybe he met Jesus once in passing sometime before the show began, or else he was poetically referring to his encounter with the shepherd who gave him the tassels. Since that shepherd had seen the baby Jesus and gave him the tassels which would eventually represent him coming back to the Jewish faith, I think it works even though it's a bit of a stretch. Yeah, it is a stretch, but all I can do is work with what I've got. For the sake of this timeline, Matthew's first encounter in the show will be a lot later in the year. In addition to these 5 major milestones, throughout the show there are also Sabbath days to work with, as well as small contextual details, such as a person saying, "I found this yesterday," "We visited there a month ago," "It's been a fun few weeks," or "We'll meet there in the morning." Most shows typically try to avoid statements like this, since it makes it far too easy to mess up their chronology, and it really just anchors things down in a set chronological timeline, but The Chosen is filled with chronological references, and it is those references which make it so difficult to make sense of the timeline in and of itself, since each reference indicates that far less time has passed than the dates demand. The novelizations also included some chronological information not found in the show, so I used that information as well when it came to making my timeline. In places where the books and show contradicted, I pretty much always favored the show, unless the book was clearly trying to reconcile a blunder in the show. The Season 3 novelization might provide even more information, but since that doesn't come out for a few more months, we'll simply work with what we've got. And now that I've laid all that groundwork, let's move on to the show you've all been waiting for. Without further ado, here is the timeline to The Chosen Seasons 1 through 3. The story begins in Canaan in 1952 BC, where the patriarch Jacob and his sons strike water at a well that they are building in the future town known as Sychar. Some 500 years later, somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula in the 13th century BC, Moses hammers together a bronze serpent to heal the people of Israel while talking to his young protege, Joshua. 400 years after that, in 1008 BC, the young fugitive David, on the run from King Saul, comes to the synagogue at Nob, where he receives bread from the high priest Ahimelech. 18 years later, in 990 BC, that same David, looking remarkably good for his age, is now king, and he sits with his wife Bathsheba on their thrones in Jerusalem as the psalmist Asaph recites them one of his psalms. Just a few decades later, on one Friday evening in 948 BC, we are introduced to a family in Kinnereth, preparing to celebrate the Sabbath day. The mother explains the Sabbath rituals to her son as the first star appears in the nighttime sky. Fast forwarding another 900 years, in 14 BC, a 6-year-old boy named Jesse falls from a tree in Hebron, paralyzing himself. Later that year, his mother dies giving birth to his brother, Simon. 6 years after that, in 8 BC, Jesse's father remarries, while he and his brother, now aged 12 and 6 years old respectively, continue to develop a deeper and deeper bond. 4 years after that, in 4 BC, a shepherd named Shimon limps into Bethlehem around the same time as a young couple named Mary and Joseph arrive from another direction. The two parties encounter one another briefly, but go on their separate ways. Later that evening, Mary gives birth to her child, and a chorus of angels appear to Shimon and his fellow shepherds out in the fields, announcing the birth of the baby boy. They collectively rush into the city where they encounter the swaddled child and worship him. They spend the rest of the night and the rest of their lives telling everyone about this baby, while his parents, back in the stable, name him Jesus. 2 years later, in 2 BC, a 5-year-old girl named Mary recites scripture with her sickly father in the city of Magdala. Later that year, her father passes away. Around a year or two later, we see Jesus being raised by his parents in the small village of Nazareth, spending his days playing around with his friend Lazarus. Around that same time, Jesse, now 20 years old, sees a Roman soldier abuse a Jewish citizen. Simon is enraged by this, and although Jesse tries to discourage him from doing so, the 14-year-old departs to join the Zealots. As time continues to pass, Jesse convinces his uncle Ram to move him from Hebron to the Pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, where he seeks day after day, year after year, a miracle to heal his malady. A few years later, Jesus is practicing carpentry with his father Joseph, who gives him an ancient bit and bridle dating back to the time of their forefathers. A few years after that, in April of AD 8, 3 days after the Passover, Mary and Joseph search frantically throughout the streets of Jerusalem until they find the 12-year-old Jesus, who explains to them that he had been in his father's house. Now we have a huge time jump. 16 years later, in AD 24, a tax collector named Matthew stops a Roman from arresting his father. Upon learning that his son is a tax collector, Alphaeus rejects Matthew, saying that he has no son. Meanwhile, Jesse has grown into an old man at the pool of Bethesda, while his brother Simon has grown into a man as well, rising through the ranks of the Zealot party. Around this time, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, Mary Magdalene, now a woman, moves to Capernaum after many tragedies facing her family. In Capernaum, she is sexually assaulted by a Roman soldier, and as time continues to pass, falls deeper and deeper into darkness. From this point forward, she goes by another name, Lilith. A little while later, one Friday afternoon, Matthew is sitting in his tax booth when he has an encounter with another man named Matthew, one of the shepherds who had seen the baby Jesus nearly 30 years earlier. It is here at long last where we arrive at the main events of the timeline. Just as a disclaimer up front, I can't even begin to tell you how many hours I sat at my computer working through the difficulties of the timeline, just trying to make it work, but I did my best. I had to work through plot holes, reconcile events, and justify inconsistencies in order to arrive at these dates. In some places, I had to add huge time jumps, and I really had to force them in at any place where there wasn't strict forced chronology. But in the end, I think that this is a somewhat satisfactory answer to fixing the timeline. Let's get to it. Our story begins in mid-August of AD 26, where we encounter Jesus on the outskirts of Capernaum, weeping as he prays to the Father, asking him to glorify himself and speak through him. This is 1 week before the events of episode 1 and falls on Saturday. Sunday morning, a girl named Abigail comes across his campsite in the woods, but she flees at the sight of Jesus. That evening, she asks her parents for permission to go exploring with her friend Joshua, while Jesus, back at his campsite, goes through his evening ritual before retiring to sleep. Monday morning, Abigail brings Joshua to the campsite where they both meet Jesus. That evening, Jesus makes a lock, calls it good, and goes to bed. On Tuesday, Jesus wakes up to a group of children standing above him. They help him with his work throughout the day, and in the afternoon return home debating about who they think Jesus to be. On Wednesday, Jesus takes the kids fishing. In the evening, he packs up his things and goes into town, only to return to his campsite later that night. Thursday, Jesus teaches the kids the Lord's Prayer, while in the evening he tends to some wounds, stretches, and goes to bed. Friday, Jesus teaches the kids about Elisha and the she-bears. Meanwhile, back in the city, Lilith awakes in her room after another demonic episode, a man fleeing away and saying that she is possessed by a demon. Around the same time, Matthew gets ready for work and hires someone to drive him there, hidden from the contempt of the crowds. That same day, Nicodemus arrives in the city with his wife Zohara. He has his first encounter with Lilith, but finds himself incapable of casting out the demons. While all this is going on, Simon, son of Jonah, loses a fight against his two brothers-in-law, then talks finances with his brother Andrew before going fishing in desperation an hour before Shabbat. That evening, Jesus prays and goes to bed, like usual. In the early morning hours of Shabbat, Simon encounters Roman soldiers while he is coming back from fishing and manages to strike a deal with Quintus. He returns home and tells his wife Eden that he's come across something big that will help them out. Meanwhile, Lilith once again wakes in an alleyway, then goes home for a doll and scripture from her childhood before visiting the local tavern known as the Hammer. Nicodemus and his wife, strangely enough, prepare for a Sabbath dinner 1 day late, but I guess that can be explained away by Nico still being shook from the events of the previous day. Outside the city, Jesus teaches the kids to sing the 133rd Psalm, and they excitedly return home. Sunday is tax day, and it's here that Simon reveals his deal with Quintus to Andrew, Matthew, and Gaius. Matthew and Gaius go to visit Quintus, while Simon and Andrew go to the Hammer. Nicodemus tells his students it was foolish of him to visit the Red Quarter, and Lilith, brought to the end of herself, prepares to throw herself off the edge of a cliff. When a dove flies overhead, she follows it to the Hammer, where she arrives just as Simon and Andrew are leaving. That same day, the kids come looking for Jesus at his campsite, but he isn't there. That's because he too has gone to the Hammer, where he encounters Lilith and calls her by her original name, Mary. He expels the demon from her, and she is restored. On Monday, Jesus teaches the children one final time, thanking them for their time. That evening, he finishes building something and attaches a note to it. On Tuesday, Abigail returns to Jesus' campsite only to find it abandoned. She discovers the small wooden playset along with a note that he left for her. About 2.5 weeks later, now into mid-September, a Pharisee named Yusuf sees Mary Magdalene while wandering through the streets. Matthew and Gaius finally talk with Quintus about Simon's deal, while Simon and Andrew continue to debate about said deal. Nicodemus continues to research exorcism, but is interrupted when he is called to the Avbet Dean, who informs him about Mary's healing. That evening, Simon and Andrew spy on fellow fishermen. The next day, on Friday, Mary is confronted by Nicodemus in the town square. That same day, Gaius breaks up a fight outside the tax booth, then talks with Matthew about his family background, while Simon and Eden argue about Simon going to work on Shabbat. That evening, everyone celebrates Shabbat dinner. Matthew attempts to visit his family, but backs out. Nicodemus hosts at a wealthy household, frustrated by the performance of it all. Simon, Andrew, and Eden eat a tense meal at Simon's house before Simon departs to go make good on his end of the deal. Jesus shows up at Mary's meal, along with James and Thaddeus. Late that night, Simon meets with Roman soldiers out by the lake. Early in the morning on Shabbat, Simon backs out of his deal, guiding the Romans into a sandbar. As punishment, they cut his ear. It's at this point right here where we reach what I'd call the first big chronological issue, because in order to make the timeline make any sense whatsoever, we have to jump forward 3 days. The rest of the episode is presented as taking place on one day, but that doesn't work given some things that Simon says later on in his conversation with Matthew. So in order to make it all make sense, let's imagine that after his encounter with the Romans, Simon decided to go for a long walk and think about his actions, and he kind of just disappeared for 3 days. After randomly going missing for 3 days, on Wednesday morning, Simon finally meets with Zebedee and confesses about his original plans with the Romans. He returns home and does the same with Eden, who rebukes him for his lack of faith and informs him that his mother-in-law is sick and will be staying with them. As he leaves his house, Andrew shows up and tells him that John the Baptist has introduced him to the Messiah, but he brushes him off. He runs into Matthew, who tells him that he only has 1 day to pay off his debt despite the fact that Shabbat isn't for another 3 days. Nicodemus tells his wife that they will stay in Capernaum a little while longer and begins investigating John the Baptist, who he is informed has been taken into custody. That evening, Simon goes fishing. Simon spends all Wednesday night and Thursday morning trying to catch fish while Matthew spies from the shore. Andrew, James, John, and Zebedee show up to help, but they catch nothing. Once the sun comes up, they see Jesus teaching from the shore. Jesus helps them miraculously catch a great multitude of fish and calls them to be his disciples. Meanwhile, Nicodemus goes to the baptizer's prison, where he interviews him about the Messiah and miracles. Simon returns home and apologizes to Eden, telling her about Jesus and their departure for Cana later that same day. Meanwhile, over in Cana, Jesus' mother arrives to help her friend Dinah prepare for her son's wedding, while Thomas and his co-worker Rama make last-minute preparations to head to the wedding themselves. That afternoon, Simon, Andrew, Big James, John, Thaddeus, Little James, and Mary Magdalene meet with Jesus to depart for the wedding. In the episode, the show presents the following events as happening on the same day, but given details in later episodes, as well as the historical distance from Capernaum to Cana, it makes sense to include an overnight stay so that they arrive in Cana on Friday afternoon, so that's what I'm going to do. On Friday, Mother Mary continues to help Dinah prepare, and Thomas and Rama arrive with the wedding supplies. That afternoon, Jesus and his disciples arrive at the wedding, and in the evening, Jesus turns water into wine. Before departing, Jesus calls Thomas to follow him, inviting him to meet them in Samaria in 12 days. And just so you know, in order to make this all work, I have to include the day of the wedding itself as day 1, because even then, Thomas is going to arrive to Samaria a day early. On Shabbat, the day after the wedding, what we can call day 2, a man has his leprosy exposed by a Galilean pawnbroker and is shunned away. That same day, Matthew explains to Gaius the benefits of Simon and Andrew's catch, while Nicodemus in the evening testifies to the Av Bet Din that John the Baptizer is harmless. On Sunday, day 3, Jesus and his disciples pack up after a day of travel. Jesus sends Simon ahead to be with his family while he goes to escort Mother Mary back to Nazareth. Back in Capernaum, Quintus talks with Matthew about Simon, promotes Gaius to Primi, and worries about the arrival of his childhood friend, Silvius Gamalius. After dropping his mother off in Nazareth, Jesus reunites with his disciples, and they encounter a woman named Tamar on the road back home. Jesus also heals the leprous man that we saw from the day before. That afternoon, they arrive back in Capernaum and go to Zebedee's house, where a crowd very quickly begins to form. Nicodemus confronts Shmuel about John the Baptizer, but they are interrupted when they hear about the crowd, as are Matthew and Gaius, who abandon their post to see what is going on. In the house, Jesus continues teaching, and when a paralytic friend of Tamar's is lowered through Zebedee's roof, he forgives the man's sins and heals him of his malady. This causes a huge uproar, leading to Jesus having to escape when Shmuel labels him a threat to the public peace. Nicodemus is dumbfounded and asks Mary to orchestrate a private meeting with Jesus. Matthew is in the same mental state and makes eye contact with Jesus as he escapes with his disciples. On Monday, day 4, Matthew is escorted by Gaius to work, while Quintus visits Nicodemus at his home to ask about Jesus. Mary apologizes to Jesus about the events of the day before and asks about setting up a meeting with Nicodemus. Jesus tells her to make the plans and tells her that he already has plans for the following night, a dinner party in the Northern District. That afternoon, Matthew visits his mother to voice his troubles, but she asks him to leave. In the evening, Jesus departs from Simon's house to meet with Nicodemus, where they have a profound nighttime conversation culminating in Jesus' invitation for Nicodemus to follow him. Jesus explicitly tells Nicodemus that they are departing at the morning of the 5th day, which means that they're going to be leaving on a Thursday. On Tuesday morning, day 5, Matthew is working at his tax booth when Jesus calls him to follow him. He leaves everything to do so. Over in Samaria, Photina draws water from Jacob's well, bringing it to her husband, who she asks for a divorce. The screen also tells us that we're still in year AD 26. If my math is right, we should be in late September by now. Back in Capernaum, that night, Matthew hosts a dinner party at his house where they're interrupted by Pharisees who warn Jesus against partying with sinners. Gaius tries to get Matthew to change his mind. On Wednesday, day 6, Nicodemus gives in to Zohara's wishes and concedes to return to Jerusalem. Gaius reports to Quintus that Matthew has quit his job, and Jesus and his disciples begin to pack up camp. That afternoon, Nicodemus delivers his closing remarks to his students and is confronted by Shmuel, who announces his plans to go to Jerusalem to look into false prophecy. Jesus meets with Eden and tells her that he sees her, then heals her mother in order to make life easier on her while Simon is away. Quintus seeks Jesus for questioning and issues an edict prohibiting religious gatherings outside the synagogue. Back in Sychar, Photina walks through the marketplace, where an orange seller won't even acknowledge her. On Thursday, day 7, Jesus and his disciples depart for Jerusalem. Jesus communicates that they have 3 days of walking to Jerusalem, but it will take a lot longer than that before they actually get to Jerusalem, weeks and weeks later at the Feast of Tabernacles. Nicodemus leaves money for Jesus and his disciples, but he doesn't join them, while Gaius that afternoon visits Matthew's parents to update them about Matthew and what he's doing. On the morning of Friday, day 8, Jesus and his disciples arrive at Jezreel, where Jesus explains that they are going to pass through Samaria, not go around it. On the late morning of Shabbat, day 9, Jesus sends his disciples into Sychar while he rests at Jacob's well. He speaks with Photina, revealing his identity to her, and she runs into the town to tell everybody what she's learned. A little while later, the chosen enter into Sychar together, ready to cause some trouble. On Sunday, day 10, James and John are plowing a field just outside the city, while Thomas and Rama journey to Sychar, accompanied by Rama's father Kophni. The show makes it seem like the following events happen on the same day, but the novelization explains that the next events happen the day afterward. On Monday, day 11, Simon and the disciples search for Jesus after he disappears, while Jesus helps a Samaritan fix the axle of his cart before going to preach in the streets. Thomas and Rama arrive in Sychar a day early, where they meet with the disciples while Melech, at dusk, discovers his recently plowed field. That evening, Jesus returns to the inn, where he meets Thomas, Rama, and Kophni, and congratulates the sons of Zebedee on a job well done. On Tuesday, day 12 since the wedding, the disciples run errands in the market, where Photina finds Simon and gives him a personal invitation for Jesus. Kophni voices his frustrations to Rama and meets with Jesus, then rebukes Thomas before departing. That afternoon, Jesus again compliments the sons of Zebedee for their field work, and that evening, they share a meal at Melech's house before spending the night at Photina's husband's house. On Wednesday, Melech wakes up to find himself completely healed. That morning, the disciples get into a debate about Jesus' schedule, leading James and John to go ask Jesus for a clarification. It's here that Jesus dubs them the Sons of Thunder after they lash out at some local Samaritans. Later that day, Jesus preaches in the Samaritan synagogue, teaching from the first chapter of Genesis. The show doesn't specify how much time passes between Season 2, Episodes 1 and 2, but my best guess is that roughly a week has passed. There has to be enough time for them to travel from Samaria north to Bashan, and for Jesus to have been away from the camp for a few days, but there can't be too much time since the group still doesn't seem to know each other very well, and the events of the previous episode are still fairly new to everyone, as you can tell by their discussions. Also, I guess they decided not to go down to Jerusalem after all. I'm assuming that what happened there is that they originally had one plan for Season 2 whenever they wrote Season 1, and then they kind of just changed it whenever it came to writing Season 2, but for some reason they decided to go north to Bashan rather than south to Jerusalem, and we're not going to go to Jerusalem until the Feast of Tabernacles in a little bit. Anyways, we're in early to mid-October by now. Over in Caesarea Philippi, Nathanael's dreams are left shattered when his construction project collapses. Over in the Bashan, Philip arrives and joins the group, introducing himself to everyone and spending the day with Matthew. At sunset, Nathanael goes out to a fig tree and cries out to God in his sorrow, while in the evening, Philip meets with Jesus, who is returning from multiple days in isolation. The next day, Mary tells Rama about her desire to study scripture more, while Philip recounts stories about traveling with John. Matthew steals away from the group to write notes about his travels, where he talks with Thaddeus and is rebuked by Simon. That afternoon, the group departs for Caesarea Philippi. In the evening, they arrive at the city, where Philip finds Nathanael and invites him to come and see Jesus. When he does so, Jesus invites Nathanael to come and follow him as well. Early the next morning, the group wakes up and makes the 4-hour hike north to the Syrian countryside, where Jesus spends the day ministering to an endless line of people. In the evening, the disciples discuss Jesus' ministry and debate theology, while Mother Mary arrives to accompany them in their travels. That night, Matthew and Simon get into a heated debate, which builds to a boiling point until Jesus silences everyone by returning to his tent exhausted from his day's work. Here we have another unspecified time jump, but given character interactions, it is clearly a few days at most, just the time needed to travel from Syria to Jerusalem. I guess if you really wanted to make Matthew's first day of meeting Jesus date work and you wanted to bump everything back to February, you could make this time jump 7 months, but that doesn't really make any sense whatsoever, and so we're just going to go with it being just under a week, and we're going to assume that Matthew was wrong with his date or that one of the other explanations I gave is to be preferred. It's now mid-October, Thursday to be exact, and we once again encounter Simon the Zealot, now a grown man, being tasked to murder a Roman magistrate named Rufus in Jerusalem. That same day, the disciples prepare for the Feast of Tabernacles outside Jerusalem, while Matthew, Nathanael, and Thomas go into the city for supplies, where they encounter Shmuel teaching in the market. That afternoon, Simon Z arrives in Jerusalem, tracked by a Roman named Atticus, and that evening he meets with fellow zealots to determine their plan. On Friday, Simon Z makes further preparations for the assassination, while the disciples spend the day finishing up their booth. That evening, they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles with Jesus. Here's one of our clear chronological milestones, falling in mid-October AD 26. On Shabbat, Simon Z listens to scripture in the temple before finally going to visit Jesse at the pool of Bethesda. Atticus warns Petronius about the coming attempt on Rufus's life, while Jesus takes Simon, John, and Matthew into the city, where they go to the pool of Bethesda, and, shortly before evening, Jesus heals Jesse. He is rebuked by Yanni for doing such a thing on the Sabbath day, but he figures that sometimes you have to just stir up the waters. Seeing his brother walking, Simon Z fails to kill Rufus, instead choosing to abandon his post as a zealot. The show presents the following events as happening on the following day, but it also presents the following events as happening after the Feast of Tabernacles, and since the Feast of Tabernacles is a week-long festival, it would seem that roughly a week needs to pass in order to maintain some level of chronological consistency, and it benefits me to add a little week here, and so that's what we're going to do. The following Thursday, Jesse is interrogated by Pharisees, and then again by Atticus as he leaves the temple. Somewhere between Jerusalem and Jericho, Mary Magdalene is picking fruit when Roman soldiers ride up, sending her into a panic. That same day, Simon Z performs his early morning spiritual and physical regimens shortly before encountering a demoniac in the woods. Jesus and his disciples meet with John the Baptist over at the Jordan River, but return to find Mary, Rama, Matthew, and Thomas being confronted by the demoniac, with Simon Z stepping in to try and protect them. Jesus casts the demon out, then takes a walk with Z and invites him to follow him. Back in Jerusalem, Yanni and Shmuel seek to instigate a formal inquiry about Jesus, but Nicodemus is suppressing it from within. That evening, Mary Magdalene wanders off to Jericho, where she returns to her old way of life. Jesus bids a tearful goodbye to John the Baptist as he departs for Jerusalem, then returns to the camp and begins to prepare for a sermon. When he learns of Mary's absence, he sends Simon and Matthew into Jerusalem to look for her. On Friday, we see Mary gambling in the Nomad while Simon and Matthew look for her. Yanni and Shmuel try to get Dunash to view Jesus as a legitimate threat, but ultimately resolve to get the much stricter Shammai on their side. Back at camp, the disciples wrestle through the difficulties of following Jesus. That afternoon, Simon and Matthew find Mary and convince her to return with them to the camp, only to learn, upon returning, that John the Baptist has been taken into custody. Mary repents and is forgiven by Jesus, who is then informed by Thomas that they're running low on supplies. The next day, on Shabbat, Jesus and the disciples visit a synagogue in Wadi Kelt, where Jesus heals a man with a withered hand, leading to a confrontation with some Pharisees who are further appalled by the fact that his disciples are plucking grain and eating it on the Sabbath. That night, the two Pharisees, Madai and Lamech, write a letter to the Sanhedrin and make plans to protest Jesus at Jotapata. The following Tuesday, Jesus prepares his disciples for his up-and-coming sermon, while Andrew continues to stress about John the Baptist. Atticus visits Quintus to talk about Jesus, while Shmuel and Yanni report to the Romans that Jesus was last seen in Jerusalem 5 days earlier. Atticus accompanies Gaius on the way to apprehend Jesus, who willingly hands himself in that afternoon. The disciples debate on how to respond, culminating in Andrew lashing out and departing for Jotapata, shortly followed by Philip. That afternoon, Jesus meets with Quintus and Atticus, while Shmuel and Yanni encounter Madai and Lamech in Jotapata. Andrew and Philip encounter Tamar and Ethan preaching about Jesus, but are prodded by Yusuf to escape the Pharisees. Late that night, Z sees Jesus praying in the distance, and the disciples reunite with Jesus, who teaches them how to pray. 2 hours later, Matthew is woken by Jesus, who asks him to help him prepare for his sermon. Alright, now this right here is where I have to put one of the most egregious time jumps thus far. We know from Season 2, Episode 7, that the events I just described happened 5 days after Jesus was last seen in Jerusalem, which means that, at most, they take place at the very end of October, since Jesus was last seen in Jerusalem at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, which takes place in mid-October. The context would suggest that only a few days, or at most, several weeks pass in between Season 2, Episode 7 and 8, but in order to make this timeline work, I've got to make it a whopping, and get ready for this, 4-month time jump. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's what I've got to do. The show doesn't allow for time jumps in many places, so we gotta take them where we can. Despite the characters not seeming to know each other that well going forward, we know for certain that several weeks have passed, but in order to make future events line up and work out, we've gotta bump it up to a third of a year. Yikes. I know, doesn't make much sense, but we do what we have to. Let's move on. It's now February of AD 27, and we see Judas and Adad purchasing land from Husham out in the wilderness of Reuben. On one Monday a little while later, they go to Jotapata, where they discuss their business deal and agree to take some time off. In Jerusalem, Shmuel and Yanni meet with Shammai and attain his support, while back in the Jotapata countryside, the disciples debate with one another while Mary and Ramah continue to work on their reading and writing. Tamar continues to adjust to the group, talking with Mary and Thomas about the group dynamic, while Jesus and Matthew continue to work on the sermon. Thad, little James, and Nathaniel find a hillside fit for the sermon, and they manage to acquire it thanks to the help of Judas and Adad. That afternoon, all the disciples go out and begin to spread the news about the sermon, which the flyers specify is happening on the third day of the week, in other words, on Tuesday. Later that afternoon, the disciples complain about Jesus always being gone, and in the evening, Jesus recites the Beatitudes to Matthew. On Tuesday, the day of the sermon, crowds arrive at the Chorazin Plateau for the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus preaches that sermon throughout the day and afterwards meets both Joanna and Judas, the latter of which he invites to come and follow him. He tells the disciples to go home and get some rest, promising to be in touch soon. As everyone heads home, Andrew departs to Machaerus with Joanna to visit John the Baptist. The following day, on Wednesday, Yusuf documents the details of Jesus' sermon and meets Jairus. Simon and Eden return home, excited for some alone time together, but are interrupted by Nathaniel and Z, who will be staying with them. The Sons of Thunder return home with Thomas, while the women go to Mary's home. Matthew, meanwhile, doesn't know where to go, so he opts to go camping. The episode makes it seem like the following events take place on the same day, but I've got to take some time jumps where I can, and since it realistically would take a few days to journey from Chorazin to Machaerus, I'm going to suggest that a few days pass in between these scenes. A few days later, Andrew and Joanna meet with John the Baptist and tell him about the sermon. A few days after that, Gaius and Atticus discuss the growing population of pilgrims in the shanty town in Capernaum, while Z and Nathaniel stir up some attention while wandering through said town. The following day, Judas departs from his home to go and follow Jesus, saying goodbye to his sister before he leaves. Yusuf leaves a note for Nicodemus with Jairus, while Andrew, finally back from his trip, goes to reconcile with Mary Magdalene, since he'd lashed out at her when she'd gone off to Jericho. See how the timeline is driving me nuts here? If you go strictly by the context of the show, it seems like only 2 weeks or so have passed between his frustration and his apology, which makes total sense. But with how I've had to adjust things because of other things in the show, over 4 months have passed, which is just ridiculous. But you'll understand why I'm doing this in a little bit. That same day, Matthew goes to reconcile with his father, asking for forgiveness and being welcomed back as their son. Gaius and Atticus take their concerns about the shanty town to Quintus, who is rebuking a servant because of the contaminated water in the cistern. Atticus announces that he is planning on going to Jerusalem to visit Pilate soon. Given how fast Andrew went to Machaerus and back, you'd think that this would be a fast journey, but buckle up, my friends, because he's going to be gone for a long, long while, and he won't be meeting for Pilate for a while. Just wait and see. The following day, Thomas tells the Zebedee household about his intentions to marry Ramah. That afternoon, Gaius abandons his post at the shanty town, obviously distracted by something, saying that his time would be better spent elsewhere. That night, Z goes to retrieve water, which he finds contaminated. He gets into a foot chase as he flees from a tracking zealot and has a rooftop chat with Atticus, who is as mysterious as ever. Back at their house, Simon and Eden finally get the intimacy they've been desiring, and Simon voices his desire to start a family with her. Alright, time for another time jump. In the show, the following events are presented as taking place on the days immediately following those preceding it, but I'm adding a 3-month time jump here to help make sense of future events we have to reconcile. Given that Eden's pregnancy is such a major plot point of the 2x2 mission, I need to work the dates around so that the mission isn't longer than 9 months, or else Eden has some major explaining to do. In order to accomplish that, I've added the 3-month time jump right here because it's the only place that doesn't hinge on events being directly the day before or afterwards. It's now June of AD 27, and after a 3-month break in their ministry, we hop back in with the women voicing concerns over money and food while teasing Ramah about Thomas. That afternoon, Jesus discusses the shanty town and his growing ministry with his disciples. At that same meeting, he appoints them as his 12 apostles and gives them details about their up-and-coming mission where he is going to send them out 2 by 2. After the meeting, Thomas receives Jesus' blessing to marry Ramah, while little James is denied his request to be healed. Jesus tells them to take a day to handle their affairs and that Simon will reach out to them tomorrow with more details. The following day, the disciples gather together at Matthew's former house. Matthew reunites with Gaius and tells him about their mission, and then Simon gives the disciples a pep talk, culminating in them circling up and reciting a psalm together. The next day, they leave on their mission. The 2x2 mission is single-handedly the most tricky event of this entire show, and really, it is the whole reason why I had to make this video to begin with. Eden's pregnancy suggests that months have passed while the disciples talk about it as if it were just a few weeks, and it seems like all the plot points in Capernaum hit a sudden pause button and experienced no further development while the apostles were out doing their thing. We know that they had to be gone during Rosh Hashanah, which takes place at the end of September, and that they had to return shortly before Purim, which takes place at the end of March, and I had to include all those huge time jumps earlier just to make it so that the mission wasn't beyond 9 months, so that Eden's miscarriage made at least a little bit of sense. If it weren't for this 2x2 mission and Eden's pregnancy, the entire ordeal would be a whole lot easier to deal with. But this stuff right here is what pushed me over the edge, and my OCD self knew I had to make a video to make it all right. As it stands, I'm going to suggest that Jesus and the apostles were gone for just under 9 months, from early June to late March. I know that sounds way longer than it's presented as in the show, but now you see my issue. Anyways, 3 months into the mission, we pick up with Jesus, who celebrates Rosh Hashanah with his mother in Nazareth, now in mid-September. He arrives late in the evening and eats dinner before retiring to bed. The following morning, Jesus celebrates the Jewish New Year, reunites with old friends, and plays some sports. That evening, he preaches in the synagogue, where he is ultimately rejected and kicked out, denied by his own people. They try to throw him over a cliff, but he escapes and visits the tomb of his father Joseph, where he meets with his mother and Lazarus before departing. Over the course of the 9-month mission, we get snippets of the disciples going about doing their thing. John and Thomas heal a blind woman in Joppa, while Nathanael and Thaddeus heal and preach and raise a woman from the dead in Perea. Simon and Judas interrupt a pagan sacrifice and cast the demons out in Caesarea Philippi, while the Jameses preach and perform healings of their own in Sharon. Z and Matthew cast out a demon and heal a lame man in Jericho, and 3 weeks before the end of their mission, Andrew and Philip preach in the Decapolis, stirring up trouble and being thrown out of the city. In early March of AD 28, 1 week after Andrew and Philip are thrown out of the Decapolis and 2 weeks before the apostles return, Eden suffers a miscarriage back in Capernaum, a fact which she keeps to herself due to the trauma of the event. We don't know when all the apostles return, but we pick up on a Sunday, with James and John in the synagogue with their father and the other disciples. Yusuf finally learns about the contaminated water and immediately informs Jairus that he will fund its repair. This is the type of stuff that I'm talking about when I say that it seems like no time has passed in Capernaum while the apostles were away. On one hand, Eden has suffered a brutal miscarriage, while on the other hand, Yusuf is just now learning about the contaminated water. It's really weird. Anyways, Jairus tells Yusuf that he's beginning to believe in Jesus, then returns home where his daughter Neely collapses. Simon returns home and surprises Eden before quickly retiring for a nap, and Eden meets Veronica, who guides her to a secret spring north of town. At Matthew's house, Mary and Tamar debate about paganism before Zeb interrupts them, having them try his new olive oil. On Monday, the 11 apostles gather together at Simon's house, recounting their mission and voicing their concerns. That same day, Zebedee sells his boat in hopes of pursuing his olive oil business, while Eden meets Veronica at the river once again, learning more about her. Jairus tells Yusuf about his daughter, warning that the contaminated water is dire. Over in Jerusalem, Shmuel and Yanni attend a Sanhedrin meeting, where Shammai gives a speech about false prophecy. When we get to Tuesday, Simon lies restlessly in bed next to Eden, while Veronica is shunned by a man who sees her discharge of blood whenever she brings his laundry back to him. That evening, Simon and Eden get into a debate with one another, but are interrupted by Jesus, who has apparently just returned from his journey, accompanied by Andrew, Mary Magdalene, Tamar, Big James, and Z. That information is going to be important for something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Simon storms out, where he talks with Gaius at the cistern, and the two begin to bond. Late that night, Jairus' wife calls to him because Neely has taken a turn for the worse. On Wednesday, Jairus is told that he needs to make preparations for his daughter's death, so Yusuf takes him to Andrew's house where they meet with Judas. Simon tries to apologize to Eden, but ends up spending the day bonding with Gaius instead as they work on the cistern. Zebedee tells his sons about the olive oil business, then goes with Judas, Mary, and Tamar to purchase an olive grove. Thad and Nathanael find Veronica and talk with her for a bit, ultimately offering to bring her to Jesus. In one of the most baffling moments in the entire episode, Z rushes in and announces to Mary and Tamar that Jesus has just returned, and I quote, from his travels, despite the fact that all three of them were with him literally the previous night, as we just saw. Meanwhile, Jesus eats breakfast at Simon's house with some of his disciples until they are ultimately interrupted by Jairus, who asks for his help. A crowd begins to gather around Jesus as he makes his way to see Jairus' daughter. Along the way, Veronica manages to touch Jesus' garment and is immediately healed. As they continue on, Jairus learns that his daughter is dead. But that's not a problem for Jesus, who immediately raises her back to life. After that, Jesus and his disciples go and have a water party in the Sea of Galilee, while Eden hopelessly watches from a distance. On Thursday, Pontius Pilate's wife wakes up after having a dream about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Pilate informs her that he has a date with an old friend later that day, but I don't know who he's talking about since his meeting with Atticus isn't until the next day. Back in Capernaum, the disciples sharpen their weapons and discuss the events of the previous day, while Quintus tells Gaius that it's about time that they get rid of the shantytown. That evening, Leander breaks into Andrew's home and tells Andrew and Philip about the craziness going down the Decapolis, and they depart with him to try to fix the problem. On Friday, Pilate and Atticus finally meet up outside Jerusalem. And this is where it gets really funny, because if you're paying close attention, given the time jumps that I had to throw in there just to make the chronology make sense, this means that over a year has passed since Atticus first mentioned his plans to go visit Pilate to Quintus. I find that absolutely hilarious, because I don't know what Atticus was doing during all that time, but I love the idea of Quintus squirming every single day in his seat, not knowing when the meeting is actually going down. I just find that absolutely hilarious. That same day, Mary and Tamar verbally duke it out and iron out their issues, and in the afternoon, Mary discovers Matthew's tassels hidden in a trunk upstairs. Simon and Eden share a tense dinner together, only to be interrupted by James and John, who mention that the disciples of John the Baptist are looking for Jesus. It's here where John makes one of the most confusing statements in the whole show. He mentions that Andrew's visit to John the Baptist
was over a month ago.
A month which has to include nothing less than 1, traveling to and from Icarus, 2, downtime before their 2x2 mission, 3, Simon and Eden's plans to start a family, 4, the apostles going out on their 2x2 mission, 5, Eden's pregnancy and miscarriage, 6, 2 weeks after the miscarriage until their return, and 7, the several days that have passed since their return. I guess technically he isn't wrong though, since according to my timeline, over a year has passed, and technically, a year is, quote, over a month. Anyways, Simon dismissed James and John and tells them that it can wait until morning. The next day is Shabbat, and we open up with Z being confronted by zealots in Tent City, but he ultimately gets them to back off and hear him out. Gaius directly disobeys Quintus's orders by helping the pilgrims out in Tent City, while Simon and the Sons of Thunder finally meet with the disciples of John the Baptist. Since no one knows where Jesus is, they end up falling asleep in the alleyway until they are woken by a crowd rushing to see Jesus, who heals several people, talks with John's disciples, and rebukes the religious leaders. That evening, he heals Shula and Barnaby on the way back home. When Simon gets back home, Eden finally tells him about her miscarriage, leaving both of them absolutely distraught. The next day is the 14th of Adar, falling at the very end of March AD 28, and everyone is celebrating the Feast of Purim. Everyone, that is, except for Simon, who is still reeling from the information that he learned the night before, and he breaks a pot in his frustration. The following day, Monday, is the second day of Purim. In Jerusalem, Shmuel interviews people, trying to find incriminating evidence against Jesus, while Atticus wanders around seeking someone to talk to about troublemakers. He is directed to talk to Yanni. Andrew and Philip, meanwhile, return from the Decapolis, where they have only made matters worse. They tell Judas what happened and agree that they need to talk to Jesus. Thomas finally returns after a long time away, informing everyone that things didn't go well with Cophni and that Remus stayed behind to try and convince him. Simon wanders into the Roman quarter, where he encounters Gaius and meets Gaius' family. Mary asks Matthew about the tassels, which she says she found the day before. That's another detail that I can't quite reconcile, because it seems like at least 2 full days have passed since she found the tassels, and it makes things even muddier, because really I would have liked to make the 2x2 mission a lot shorter, and I would have liked to add a time jump after Simon learns about the miscarriage, but I can't do that because Mary specifically mentions here that she found the tassels yesterday, which is just really, really confusing, because that's not even possible, but it definitely means that it couldn't have been multiple weeks or months since then. But I digress. Matthew gets mad and storms off, but in the evening he returns and tells her his backstory, and the two get to learn a little bit more about each other. I also don't know where all Simon and Gaius walked in the Roman quarter, but they left his house during the daytime, and by the time they get to the edge of the Roman quarter, it's evening. So I guess they had a good long chat together. Thad helps Matthew attach his tassels to his robes, and Jesus gathers the disciples together to discuss the Decapolis debacle, making plans with them to leave the following morning to go and handle it. He tells John to stay back and wait for Simon, who is the key to the whole mission. The next day, Jesus and the apostles head to the Decapolis. Simon is rebuked by both John and Zebedee for being so distracted, and he reluctantly goes with John to the Decapolis, finally telling someone about Eden's miscarriage. Further ahead, Jesus and the apostles arrive, and Jesus wastes no time getting into some trouble. He heals Telemachus' father and begins to engage in debate with various people groups as thousands of people gather all around. Simon and John show up not long afterward, and the Decapolis powwow ensues, with Jesus healing a crippled man and leading a large discussion, trying to smooth out some issues. Back in Capernaum, Zeb, Salome, and Mary have an intervention for Eden, who tells them about her miscarriage. Meanwhile, Nashon takes a horse that can travel at super speed down to Jerusalem, where he awakes Shmuel late in the night and asks him to join him back in the Decapolis. Back with the crowds, Jesus tells them to get some rest after having taught them for a long, tiring night. The next day, the Pharisees travel to the Decapolis to see what's going on with Jesus, Atticus following not far behind. They also travel at super speed, making a multiple-day journey in just a few hours. Jesus teaches the multitude for quite some time, culminating in the feeding of the 5,000. That afternoon, the Pharisees arrive as everyone departs, and Jesus invites Shmuel to come pray with him on top of a mountain. The disciples rent a boat and begin traveling back to Capernaum across the sea. Back in Capernaum, Eden and her mother meet with Yusuf, who reads to her a psalm of Asaph. That evening, she bathes in the mikveh, crying out to God on Simon's behalf. Early on Thursday morning, the disciples are caught in the middle of a storm until they see Jesus walking atop the water. Simon walks out to Jesus and has his sea-top therapy session, and then they return to the boat as Jesus calms the sea. Later that day, Simon returns home and reunites with Eden, while Matthew weeps as he contemplates his tassels, Gaius tending to his sick son, while Thomas looks starry-eyed at the distant moon. In Tel Dor, Rama thinks deeply as she writes a letter, and over in Machaerus, John the Baptist is still in prison. Over a decade later, in AD 44, the Apostle John gathers together with his fellow disciples as they grieve the martyrdom of his brother James. He interviews Simon, Andrew, Thomas, Nathanael, Thaddeus, little James, Matthew, Mary Magdalene, and Mother Mary, making preparations for an account he is planning to make on the person and work of Jesus Christ. 4 years later, a man named Tychicus sneaks Mary Magdalene into a city, where she is greeted by Lazarus, who brings her to a dying Mother Mary. Mary fondly reflects on giving birth to Jesus, and shares with Mary Magdalene the song that she sang shortly after becoming pregnant with the child. 1 week later, Mary Magdalene arrives in Rome, where she delivers Mother Mary's song to Luke, who is writing a gospel of his own. And there you have it, boys and girls. There's the definitive Chosen plotline for The Chosen seasons 1 through 3, with all plot holes and continuity errors fixed. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Until next time, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy, and I will see y'all next time. Maranatha.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.